Today's 100th episode of Socially Democratic is presented to you by Dunn. Dunn partnered with businesses, organisations, unions and social democratic parties across the globe to develop community organising strategies and train leaders to build power from within their community. And in 2021, Dunn will continue to work with folks that want to share their stories, inspire others, take action, give hope and organise communities for change. To find out how you can partner with Dunn, hit us up at dunstreet.com.au. Socially Democratic is also presented to you by Maurice Blackburn Lawyers. Are you passionate about providing access to justice? Maurice Blackburn, Australia's leading plaintiff law firm, is looking for an associate to join their employment and industrial law team on a full-time, permanent basis. You'll use your legal technical knowledge and expertise to strive for fair outcomes for Maurice Blackburn's clients. The role is based in Melbourne, Victoria, and to apply, go to mauriceblackburn.com.au/careers. Be part of change and fight for fair. Apply now. Do people still say /? Do we just say slash? I don't know. Anyway, but you should go. That sounds like a fantastic employment opportunity at one of Australia's leading plaintiff law firms, Maurice Blackburn. Hello and welcome to 100th episode of Socially Democratic, your weekly centre-left politics and organising podcast that dives into the progressive campaigns and issues of the day and the people leading them from home and abroad. And on this week's episode, we travel north of the Murray to the Emerald City, to Sydney, to speak to the CEO of the McKell Institute, Michael Buckland. The McKell Institute is the leading progressive research institute and public policy think tank. And Michael is on the show today to discuss the recent COVID outbreak in New South Wales and the response to it by both the Berejiklian and the Morrison government. So I'm very much looking forward to hearing Michael's insights into what's happening on the ground in Sydney and his thoughts about how it's being played out at the moment and the implications it will have for not just people in New South Wales, but across the country going forward. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcast, Spotify and Stitcher. And if you like the show, let us know by leaving us a review on either your Apple Podcast app or on Podchaser. And for all updates, follow us at Dunn on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and LinkedIn. And before we get to today's episode, can I take the opportunity, given it is our 100th episode, to thank a number of people. First of all, I want to thank my producer, Rebecca Connell, who produces the episode week in, week out. She does a fantastic job lining up the guests for each week's episode. She then obviously does all the editing of the episode, which requires a lot because I constantly make mistakes all throughout the episode, and then publishes it and does all of the social media work as well for the episode and for Dunn too. So Rebecca, thank you very much for your hard work and expertise in making this podcast happen. Can I also thank our guests that have come on our first 100 episodes? I really, really appreciate your time and your energy and your thoughts and your insights, and really proud to give you guys a platform to share those thoughts with our wider audience. We are the only centre-left politics and organising podcast in this country. And it's critical that your voices are heard in and amongst the community. So we really do appreciate you coming on the show and doing that. And lastly, can I thank our followers, our dedicated, loyal listeners that have listened to Socially Democratic from day one, and the people who have come on across this journey. The podcast has grown in its audience share over this time since we began in, I can't even remember, February, March, April, May 2019. God, so much has happened since then. We really appreciate your dedication and your feedback and your support as well. The messages of well wishes that you leave us, your positive and also your constructive criticism of the show as well. We do it for you guys. So thank you very, very much for your support in listening to Socially Democratic, and we hope to do another 100 episodes beyond this. Okay, let's get to today's episode. Okay, we're taping this one on a Friday morning in lockdown Melbourne again, and joining me on the line from lockdown Sydney, What lovely unity our two states have right now is Michael Buckland, who's the CEO of the McKell Institute, which is the leading progressive research institute dedicated to providing practical and innovative solutions to contemporary policy challenges. And we have a bit of a policy challenge today to try and nut through, which is COVID. And Michael's going to come on the show today to talk to us about the experience of the lockdown in New South Wales. Michael Buckland, welcome to Socially Democratic.
Thank you for having me. I'm very excited to be here.
You're in your fourth week now of lockdown in Sydney, or is it your fifth? I've lost count.
It is the fifth week, but I'm close to losing count as well. It's been a little bit frustrating after hearing how we'd escaped all the chances of lockdown, but then again, it's hard for me to complain about being in lockdown to someone from Melbourne. So.
How has it compared to, I guess the last time the city was in a sort of a substantially big lockdown would have been way back in March 2020 when we all first discovered what this whole coronavirus thing was. How does lockdown compare to over a year ago?
Well, certainly last time it was longer and probably just as harsh, but there was something of a novelty. It was something new we were all getting used to. I think there was a certain sense of scale. This is something happening at a global scale. No one's unaffected. We all need to jump in. And that was reflected also in the policy decisions made by our leaders. So, JobKeeper came on board. There was a national response. There was a lot of togetherness at the time. And it was actually something I felt very positive about, even while, we could get into a whole lot of details about whether National Cabinet has worked. I don't think it has. But certainly the intention behind it was, these were all things about solidarity and I felt very promising. This time, completely different because, it feels like it's been so long. It feels like we were sort of out of it and that we were, instead of using that time to prepare for the next lockdown or the next outbreak, we kind of lay on our hands a little bit. And I think that's why you see so much frustration with the vaccine rollout.
I compared the very first lockdown way back in March to sort of when you're a kid and maybe your house loses power and you have to go stay at your cousin's house for the week or something. It felt really exciting. It was like you're camping or something, like it was like, oh, this is really cool. People were making sourdough and we're doing Zoom calls and, we're just binging Netflix. But the second time around and the third and the fourth and the fifth is like, it's the basics. I'm just getting by. So I'm wondering if that's been the experience for you guys up in Sydney.
I don't think, because it hasn't been as repetitive, we did escape that sort of second wave lockdown that you had late 2020. But not everyone did. My sister is in the Northern Beaches. And so she cancelled her wedding in the UK. She's marrying a UK guy at the beginning of the year. Then she moved to the Northern Beaches just before Christmas and had her big 30th and cancelled that, and then cancelled her wedding again early this year when there was a further up. So, she's feeling it very differently. I'm quite lucky. But I agree with you. And also there's last year, just now that I'm thinking about it, my kids, both of them were in childcare and childcare became free. And so, again, it was this sort of great part of this solidarity. We were all jumping in. This time, my daughter's in kindergarten. I tell you what, homeschooling in kindergarten is a lot more difficult, and I've got a lot more sympathy for all those people in Melbourne who were doing it all last year and are doing it again. So I can't, I think it's affected people in different ways, but certainly I felt a lot better last year than I did this year, and I felt the support was there last year that I don't feel is there this year.
I have a theory. A lot of people are looking at this as, is it a health crisis? Is COVID an economic crisis? I think certainly I think the experience in Victoria, and I'm interested to get your thoughts on this outside of our state and what the view is in Sydney and maybe other parts of the country as well. Because I know through the McKell you do a lot of travel and are interacting with other states. But I think the Victorian view is that we don't view COVID as a health crisis because we don't really know anyone that's died from it. Now, notwithstanding there's been 800 people in the state of Victoria that have passed away. Clearly it has impacted some people. But broadly speaking, I don't think that we've seen it as a health crisis, nor do I think that we have seen it as an economic crisis to this point because JobKeeper kind of insulated the Australian economy. So I don't think a lot of people, I mean, obviously, once again, there are people that are doing it tough, but broadly speaking, I think most people got by last year because of the working arrangements that they've got. They can work from home, or JobKeeper managed to just keep them afloat. I think that the thing that people see COVID as a crisis is a societal crisis, and that the people are feeling isolation and the impact of isolation because of lockdowns, homeschooling, having to work from home, can't visit family, can't visit friends, missing birthdays, weddings, funerals, can't visit family overseas. Melbourne's got a large multicultural population. In our winter, I'd say a quarter of Melbourne would flood to Southern Europe to go visit family, right? Or indeed, Australians can't return home, so we're missing our loved ones that are living overseas and can't come back. And so I think it's the impact, or people would view this as a societal crisis, not as a crisis of a health or economics. What's your thoughts on that from a New South Wales perspective?
Certainly at the beginning of the crisis, it was almost exclusively a health, seen in health terms. And over time, we've seen a binary emerge between the health crisis and the economic crisis. But I think the way you've described it is so much more accurate. And it's not the way that our leaders are necessarily responding to this crisis. I think we've exposed a whole lot of fault lines around how society is giving us less time for community connection. And then this just shows how important that is. The lack of open space in certain communities, in inner city communities, has become a huge issue in Sydney, where often you'll see local parks will be more crowded than any bar ever was before COVID. And then you also have housing. I talk about my own experience a lot just because obviously we all do, but there, if you're living in a share house, you're now working in a share house as well. And so, you might be sleeping and working in the same room and rarely leaving that room. Those are huge things and create a huge disparity between people who might have a spare study or a swimming pool in the backyard. And, that changes the demand for housing and really exposes a divide. And I think that what's going to end up happening is people will be researching for a social response at the end of all this. We've had the health response. The economic response seems urgent too, or is urgent to a degree. But where people are looking for, okay, we've suffered through these years. I want to know that the next few years are going to be better, and the society we build after this is going to be fairer. And I think there's going to be a huge demand for that when we come out of it.
Let's talk about the response to this this new wave, this new outbreak in New South Wales, and I just want to get your thoughts on the performance of the Berejiklian government in dealing with it. And then the second half of the show, then I want to sort of then turn the torch on the Scott Morrison government as well. And I come at this with, there's no doubt that certainly in the Victorian experience, there is a level of Schadenfreude that exists amongst some Victorians about what's going on in New South Wales. And I need to be clear, though, I think that most Victorians, it's directed at Premier Berejiklian and the political elite, and I include journalists in that, and certainly not directed at the people of New South Wales. Nobody wants to go through this. It's a shit state of affairs, and I wouldn't wish it upon anyone. But I'm reminded by that quote that Premier Berejiklian said a while back. I fear for Victoria, and I worry about what their government may do. We have demonstrated to other states it is possible to manage an outbreak and not shut a city down. Meanwhile, you have Phil Corey writing on the front page a puff piece declaring Gladys as the woman that saved Australia. My first question is, how much did the hubris of the Berejiklian government in talking up their own processes about contact tracing and the New South Wales health system factor into the decision-making processes that they took when the outbreak first happened back in 5, 6, 7 weeks ago?
I think it hugely affected the initial response. And I think that that's being increasingly not disputed. There was talk in the first couple of days that the initial delay might have had something to do with the New South Wales budget, which was being delivered, and the government didn't want to they wanted to give clear air. And that budget was, to a large degree, it was a victory lap. It said the budget assumed that we would not have any statewide lockdowns in the coming year. The first one to occur was within a week of that budget. And I think it showed the decision making, but it also showed what happens when I think, I'm loath to point the blame at one individual person, because we know that within the leadership in New South Wales that there are varying opinions about lockdowns. And there are certainly some people who have been a lot more wanting to avoid a lockdown at almost all costs. And if anything, I think the Premier has been on one of the people in the cabinet who's been a little bit more cautious about wanting to lock down. But ultimately, the people who sort of were the anti-lockdown group won out over the last year because they convinced the public and everyone that we had it under control. And that meant that the caution was sort of thrown to the wind. And I think it was a problem. And that feeling you're describing in Victoria of people being, not directed at the people of New South Wales, but at our leaders, as sort of a bit of comeuppance maybe, but is felt by people here too. Where we didn't need the victory lap. We didn't need the celebrating ourselves. And it goes back to something I mentioned at the beginning here, which was we had this great feeling of unity and solidarity at the beginning of last year. And I mean, I'll blame Morrison as the first one to really break that when he went after Victoria in the way that he did. And I thought that was, I thought that he did a disservice, not just to himself, but to the country at the time. And, but then everyone jumped on board with that. And so in New South Wales, we said, oh, well, now it's New South Wales is the best. And, Queensland's saying they're the best. And, at a certain point, we've got to realise that this doesn't decide, the virus isn't determined by your politics. And I want to say one more point about this, which was that in New South Wales, there's been a stream. If you listen to the Premier's daily press conferences, it's all about the Delta strain. The Delta strain is worse than anything before. The Delta strain, and this is the cover, which, by all means, it sounds like it is more contagious, and there are additional experiences there. But the Delta strain was prevalent in the last Victorian snap lockdown, which is where that quote comes from that you just cited, and Victoria managed to get on top of it. So I guess what I'm saying is, yes, it is more difficult, but let's treat that for what it is, which is that's an excuse.
Look, it's an interesting point you make, and maybe we'll talk a bit about it later on in the show in terms of national unity, because I completely agree with you. I felt that, I think most Australians felt that sense of unity way back in March last year. And then slowly it just kind of unravelled. What I've been surprised by was the slow response by the New South Wales government to lock down the city, and maybe even the state, but certainly the city, demonstrated to me that lessons weren't learned from the mistakes that we made in Victoria last year for our second lockdown. We did move too slowly. Like if you go back and look at the numbers now, look at what it takes for us to lock down a city now compared to what it was in that second wave. Well, like it was 190 odd cases or something. We had 3 and we're shutting the place down, we were way too slow. And I think that showed everyone else that, if you want to go hard and you want to go early. And it didn't happen in New South Wales. And I just sort of think to myself, what's going on at National Cabinet? Why aren't they, from campaigning, we all know that, after an election campaign in another state, we all go and call up that state or go and visit that state and go, well, what did you do right? What did you do wrong? Let's all share our best practices. From a policy perspective in dealing with this global crisis, this doesn't seem to be happening.
yeah, I mean, but this goes to the breakdown of unity and of arrogance. And one of the things that the state budget in New South Wales, which was, I guess, a timely reminder of messaging right before this, so that's why I go back to it. But we talked about the New South Wales Treasurer talked about bringing pride back to New South Wales. People are proud of their state again. Ahead of the most recent lockdown, and I go back to the budget speech because it is sort of a nice time capsule before all this became so prevalent. But we talked about bringing pride back to New South Wales. To be honest, yes, I want to have a bit of pride in my state, but I'm Australian. I want to feel that pride in Australia. And even more recently, then there was a story about contract tracers from other states helping out in New South Wales. This was just a couple of days ago. And when asked about it, the health minister said, oh, well, WA only gave us about 5 people. It's completely unnecessary. Let's not go into these. Let's just be grateful for whatever we have, but we've got to stop this pulling apart. And the one way to stop ourselves pulling each other apart based on state jurisdiction is the National Cabinet, and it's turned into nothing. What leadership are we getting from National Cabinet? I don't see any. Are there any standardised lockdown rules? So maybe National Cabinet should have developed out of Victoria a procedure. Okay, once you get to a threshold, and the state could determine that threshold, this is what a lockdown looks like. And it includes these professions, and you could even tell people that when the times are good, so that then everyone knows if we go into lockdown, these are the rules, and we're not making it up in a panic as we go. We saw this very recently when Victoria had a list of professions that were considered essential or non-essential, but they defined the list so that people knew whether they could go to work. National Cabinet had the perfect opportunity. It had all the right people in the room to be developing a standard response so that should a lockdown be triggered, we all know what the rules are. Instead, New South Wales has a rule where, I'm in one of the 3 LGAs in which you cannot leave the LGA for work unless you are in an essential profession. And essential wasn't defined. And I think a day later it was defined, clearly out of response. But in Victoria, they do have a defined essential and non-essential list. In South Australia, their rule is that you cannot travel outside of, I think it's 25 kilometres from home. Okay, this is great, but why do we have different rules for lockdown across the 3 states? Now, if one state disagrees, that's fine, but this is the perfect opportunity for National Cabinet to have it. And if you explain to the public that in the event of a lockdown, these are the rules, and we all know the rules, and maybe they're divided first by LGA and then by city and then by state, but we're then able to digest that, and we don't go into these lockdowns in a panic. But instead, I've seen really nothing. Like a National Cabinet seems to be the opportunity for states to say we're not getting enough vaccines, which is a whole nother issue I'm sure we'll talk about, and the national government to say, the states are locking down too much and not providing enough support. It failed in its initial mission.
Because, I think from an outsider's perspective, looking at what was going on in the sort of maybe 2 or 3 weeks ago, the inconsistency, the reports, remember that footage of everyone at Bondi on the weekend all, swanning around, or stories about high-end luxury stores still open, all that kind of stuff. And the natural inclination is to go, oh, God, Sydney-siders, honestly, would you, do the right thing? But you go, hang on a minute. You're only going to do the right thing if your government tells you what to do. And the government have showed no leadership on this whatsoever. They have been inconsistently consistent right across the board. And I think a lot of Victorians are screaming out going, why haven't you just had a very clear, there are only 4 reasons or 5 reasons you can leave home. Institute a curfew, bring in limits about how far you can go. Because obviously the whole point is to restrict movement. One thing I found from the lockdown last year in Victoria was, the curfew, when they brought in the curfew, everyone going, that's a bit harsh, but it really drove home to us all that this is serious shit. Like, normally when you think about curfews, you think about Argentina in the 1970s, for Christ's sake. It's not like,
yes,
it's like, oh my God, they're having a curfew, fuck. But when the minute they brought in the curfew, I went, okay, this is serious. And it also reminds you, at 7 o'clock, I can't go outside now. Like if I wanted to go do my daily exercise, I've missed my chance. I just think that I don't think it's fair to blame the citizens of Sydney. I think the blame has to lay directly at the feet of the New South Wales government and their inability to be clear with directions to the people about how we are going to get on top of this current outbreak.
Well, going into this in a little bit of detail, let's take what they're saying first, because you're right. Guidance needs to be given, or else how do you expect people to obey rules that they don't understand? Especially when those rules are changing daily. I saw someone on the street the other day who just said, when I was watching the 11 a.m. press conference, and they just said, I can't keep up. And they kept walking. There's no way they can keep up with the changing rules. But Gladys has said, the Premier has said that we announce things in response to the crisis and then we refine. Which, makes sense to a degree, I guess, from it's frustrating from the sort of people's perspective. But we see this most recently in the shutdown of the construction industry. So the government went to a step that even in Victoria was not part of any lockdown, and shut down the construction industry in New South Wales a couple of days ago. Within 24 hours, it was guaranteed. You were allowed to go to construction only to make sure it was safe, and if you had essential work to undertake. And then within 48 hours, there was a guarantee that the construction industry would reopen at the end of the month. The same guarantee has not been given to any other industry, but really shows that it's a government responding, I think, to political pressure. And this can be quite a valuable, I've observed it for a long time. And to many degrees, a government responding to the public can be quite an asset. Where it's a bit more difficult is during a pandemic. And to take your point about people in Bondi, the Premier said that no one has caught COVID from outdoor exercising. That's what she said. So to a degree, you say, well, maybe while it sends the wrong message, you're right. Maybe there's an amount of that's reasonable that you don't that you allow crowds, you discourage them, but you allow them to a degree in open air. But that message would be far better received if it was explained well before the confusion and daily crisis of an outbreak and a lockdown. And so, why, if there was a plan that said, look, we all know that this virus spreads mostly indoors and at workplaces, and so therefore the first stage of a lockdown is in those environments, not in the public, then we would all be very well prepared for what we're going through right now. Instead, I know people who see the Bondi outbreak and say, how come my shop is closed, I'm earning no money, and people are still able to congregate in larger crowds than wherever in my store out on the beach. And you know what, going to your other point, it's not just about giving people a sense of what the rules are to allow them to follow them. You also have to allow them economically to follow them. The $600 COVID-19 disaster payment, which is the current payment, is less than minimum wage. If you're a retail worker, and the largest employer in my LGA outside of healthcare is retail, right? I live in one of those LGAs where you cannot leave the LGA unless it's essential work. So if you work in the Louis Vuitton store in Sydney and you're a full-time retail worker, even if you're earning minimum wage, right, you just lost 40% of your income because you cannot attend your shifts. So you're not earning any income from your employer. and your income now goes straight to a maximum of $600 a week. Try paying a mortgage in Sydney on $600 a week. I'm sure it's the same in Melbourne. You cannot do it. And this is where you cannot ask people in some of the most areas with the highest precarious employment, the highest levels of casualisation, to make a sacrifice for their work, but then you don't give them the economic support to allow them to obey it. And I mean, that's why you're getting removalists moving, because they don't get paid if they don't get it, and they're not paying their mortgage if they're on $600 a week. And I just think that's the truth of it.
And that's in my opening remarks when I sort of talked about that. Is it a health crisis? Is it an economic crisis? When I said it's not an economic crisis to this point, because what I think I'm worried about now is the Morrison government are kind of saying, well, we've given you your financial sugar hit last year. That was a one-trick pony. We're not doing that again. But mate, and as I said, we will get onto the vaccine rollout. But whilst you have failed to vaccinate our nation, we are going to continue to have outbreaks, and therefore you need to continue to put your hand in your pocket and support those people that are making a sacrifice to keep this outbreak under control.
Yeah, if the government makes a decision to, and let's make this outside of just this crisis. If the government makes a decision that an industry or a job can no longer exist, it has a responsibility to make sure that there is a transition to something else, that there's support arrangements. And we see the same thing when, a couple of years ago in New South Wales, the government tried to shut down the greyhound racing industry, right? People said, well, okay, like, where's the support plan? Why, you can't just turn around overnight and shut something down. And if anything, I thought that's a very liberal, individualist idea of not allowing the government to just take away your rights. I think that we acknowledge there's a need to sacrifice, but and I don't want anyone to misinterpret my comments as saying that we shouldn't be making these sacrifices. But the point is that we should be empowered by the government to be able to make the sacrifices, because right now some of us are hurting a lot more than others.
Communication during a crisis is so critical, and the 150 odd days straight that the Premier in Victoria, Daniel Andrews, communicated directly to the people of Victoria through his press conferences became such an integral part of daily life of Melburnians, but also to be able to relay new information about where we are right now and where we're going and what our plan is, without filter by the media, which obviously, I've talked about this ad nauseum on this podcast about how that gave the journalists the absolute shits and, deal with it. What I found watching, most mornings I will watch the New South Wales Daily COVID press conference and then flip over to the Victorian equivalent. And at the moment, the contrast is quite stark, and I'm interested to get your thoughts on this. I said this on Twitter the other day and got absolutely no laughs whatsoever because clearly it was a shit joke. But the New South Wales press conference is like the New York City subway system. It's chaos. People are shouting at each other. People look tired. Everyone's angry. Whereas the Victorian version feels like the Tokyo metro system. It's calm. It's quiet. People are respectful. It's on time, and we all know where we're going. I feel like both the journalists and the Premier and Health Minister Hazzard are starting to feel the heat right now, and it's fraying their attentions. What are your thoughts about this and not being able to actually communicate clearly to the public about where we're going?
Well, you might be right, although I dare say that maybe when Peter Credlin comes on your Tokyo train, it starts to look a lot more like the New York Metro.
Oh yeah, without a doubt.
I mean, part of this is, I was a long-time observer of the New South Wales Parliament, and and that is there is a certain journalist culture that is quite aggressive, abrupt in the way they ask questions. It's designed to provoke, and I think it sort of comes from the rough and tumble world. And so, to a degree, I think that you see some of that. And I certainly noticed that in contrast to the federal. So I'd say that there's the cultural element that's always been a part of it. But, what is interesting is that that has shifted over time. So the the early on in the lockdown, I remember seeing comments and both people on, whether it was Twitter or in news outlets, saying that people in New South Wales are giving the journalists in New South Wales are giving New South Wales politicians an easy run, and not holding them to account. Whereas in Victoria, they were blamed incessantly for everything last year. Now I think that is turning, and I think people are getting sick of it. But it's not really, it hasn't coalesced around an alternative. There's segments that are, we've shut down too fast, we've shut down too slow, we've shut down too much, we've shut down too little. And so I think it is a little bit of chaos right now, and that's what's making it hard for the public. But I think your observation about people getting information directly from politicians through this is the right one. Whenever I found myself walking as our one source of exercise at 11 o'clock, you see people in their front yards, they're watching it. You hear it in cars as they drive past, and certainly it's become part of my routine. And I think that's really important. And there's a key example, and I might just, it's a very unique point, but it's an important point. When most recently, when the harsher retail lockdowns were announced, the government said that they were banning all non-essential retail except for what was on a list. And that was publicly reported. Now, there was a caveat there that non-essential retail could still operate click and collect or takeaway or delivery. In the vast majority of media coverage off the back of that announcement, it left off takeaway. And that means everything. So coffee shops were closed, except for delivery and click and collect. Of course, takeaway. So I guess what I'm saying is, when you read the government's announcement, they have sometimes thought of these things. And so there is a problem when the filter, and I try not to blame journalists, because they're partly responding to a changing daily set of rules, and they've got to communicate it efficiently as well as correctly. But missing out on something as small as that left to huge panic. You should have seen the P&C group on my phone, on the WhatsApp groups in our local community, chat, Facebook group. Everyone was confused because they thought everything was shutting down, and it wasn't as bad as that. Now, maybe that's a good thing, because sometimes we do need to be shocked into doing the right thing. But it does create a lot of confusion. And so I guess that direct communication, what I'm saying, is ultimately a good thing.
Here's my worry, and I'm interested to get your thoughts on what worries you the most at this point regarding the way that the government's handling it and where it's going. What I'm worried about, and I think you kind of alluded to it earlier, is that the internals within the New South Wales government, some are probably very much pro lockdown. Let's get on top of this outbreak, and then reset. And there would be some in the government that would be like, this is bullshit. I don't believe that COVID is a serious thing. I'm pro business. Let's just open up and let it rip, because we've been doing this now for 5 weeks. The numbers aren't coming down. This it's not working. So let's just let it rip. That really worries me a lot, because talking about how this can, Daniel Andrews and a whole bunch of other premiers have always said, this is a national problem. This isn't just a Victorian problem or a New South Wales problem. And the moment that rips, and we've seen that this Delta variant is incredibly fleeting. Although that remark initially was lampooned by sections of the Murdoch press. How that's coming back to bite them on the arse. This variant is incredibly fleeting, and what happens if we just do let it rip? Really, really, really worries me in a big way. At this point in time, what is your biggest concern going forward?
I've got to echo that, and let's just bust a myth before we get into this conversation. In Sweden, where they had potentially the most lax lockdowns from the very get-go, the economy tanked more than in other countries with lockdowns. So this binary of if we got rid of lockdowns, our economy would be fine is nonsense. It's not going to be fine. All that happens is that you also get the deaths. And so, it's not a either or. But that's a myth that's persisted, and it's still guiding certain policymakers. To a degree here, let's give a little bit of credit to Gladys, where she is probably one of the people on the more cautious end. I don't think that's her approach. She's made it clear that she wants 80% vaccination rates before we start to consider reopening. What is more worrying, though, is that the response to that 80% was pretty violent in New South Wales. There were articles saying that 80% figure might be the number that loses her the premiership. Federally, you had Walensky and Wilson say that we should reopen on 60%, which is a very different number. Now, regardless of where you sit on that, at some point we do need to talk about reopening, but now certainly we reopen because we've judged the health crisis as manageable, not because we've given up trying to control a Delta variant. And I also think that's a little bit of an insult to everyone else. Australians have suffered so much over the last 18 months to try and fight this crisis. For someone to come in at the end, especially in Victoria, I can't imagine how you would feel if New South Wales said, hey, we really appreciate you guys getting it under control last year and spending months in lockdown, but it's really not for us. So we're just going to let it rip. And that means that if you want to keep it out of Victoria, you have to do the hard lockdown and you'll get slammed in the press every day for doing so. Like, what a way to repay you for that sacrifice. And what a way to further alienate and divide Australians. So, I think that's a really damaging thing. But there are, I think it's Stuart Ayres and it is the sports minister. So why he would have a huge sway, I don't know. But and others in New South Wales have been certainly arguing for we need to reopen. I don't think that the New South Wales public will accept it. And because of that, I think that the New South Wales government, which has shown itself to be quite responsive to public opinion in both good and bad ways, I don't think they'll let it happen. But the mere fact that they're talking about it is a problem. And federally, the next battle is over that percentage figure. And you can see it happening already. The Commonwealth government will want to get there to achieve victory in their vaccination program. And to achieve victory, one way to do it is to lower your standards, to lower the point of victory. And so instead of 80%, it becomes 60%.
That's a good opportunity to turn our attention to federal politics and the federal government. Broadly speaking, your thoughts on the performance of the Morrison government in 2021. How do you rate the PM's performance so far in handling this, both the crisis of COVID and also the vaccine rollout?
I think complete lack of urgency, complete lack of vision, complete lack of ability and self-reflection as well. Even the last couple of days, there's been talk about an apology, and it's really bunkum. But the McKell Institute did a lot of work on the vaccine rollout because it is the biggest public policy question of the year, of maybe the decade, is how quickly we get ourselves vaccinated. And, there's been a lot of talk of the failing to vaccinate 4 million people by March. Certainly that would have reduced, lockdowns now. Our first paper on this examined the likelihood of additional state lockdowns as a result of the delayed vaccine rollout. So for every day you don't have a certain population vaccinated, you are more likely to spread the virus. You're more likely, therefore, to have a state lockdown. And we found that we would spend an extra month in lockdown. And that came true about 3 weeks ago. And now it's even worse. We then looked at international border closures and the costs of not allowing international students and international travel. And we found that we're talking about $240 million a day in costs to those industries. So that's aviation and, you know, everything going into our tertiary education sector. Coincidentally, also sectors that have received remarkably little support from the Morrison government. So I look at his performance and I see all these failures, but then I also try and see where is he trying to get out of them. Because he blamed the supply issues early on, and perhaps that was a problem. Certainly, I think there's big questions to ask as to whether or not he did enough to secure variety of supply or whether he put too many eggs in one basket. I then think they've done a very poor job in explaining the AstraZeneca issues and where those aren't issues. Instead, you know, we now have a situation where there's AstraZeneca supply that people just won't accept. There is supply. That's what they're telling people now. So we're not getting it. But we've all suffered because of this delayed vaccine rollout. It is the biggest public policy failing in years. And I see it only slowly getting better.
The vaccine rollout. There was an article, I think I read this morning in The Conversation, that was talking about it as being the greatest public policy failure of our time, of our generation in Australia. The only other two I can think of is the original BAS statements that we all had to do, or maybe the Sydney monorail. Other than that, the rollout has been a disaster. But even just the acquisition of vaccines in the first place had me worried, because I'd heard way back that Bibi Netanyahu, the former Prime Minister of Israel, which is great to say, for all of his faults, made over 40 phone calls to the CEO of Pfizer in the first 24 hours the moment Pfizer announced that they had certification for their vaccine was ready to be rolled out to the public. And he secured over 7 million doses. Meanwhile, Hunt and Morrison sat on their hands and continue to sit on their hands for months. Where does this inaction come from? And I really am glad to see that the federal Labor opposition are finally starting to, develop some clarity in their narrative towards the Morrison government in saying that you only had 2 jobs. Personally, I just boiled it down to 1 job. You had 1 job. Just get a frigging vaccine and roll it out. That was it. The states are doing everything else. But anyway, you only had 1 job. Where does this inaction come from Morrison?
I think it's the end point of a shift in what we expect national leaders to do and what we expect them to be. Australia has been following a pattern of other similar democracies where our leaders are increasingly just there for the daily politics. They're not showing vision. They're responding to events, and they're doing so in a way that is about marketing and spin, because their job is to win elections, not to lead the country. And, I've seen it for multiple political parties. You see it overseas, and it's a really sad development. So if we bring it back to Morrison specifically, his way of responding to these concerns is, wait till it's brought up in the media with Kevin Rudd talking to the CEO, and then he made a phone call a couple of days later to get it off his back. But where's the vision? Like, if he was presenting Pfizer is not the priority for Australia. Let's say he said that. Maybe he says that is not our direction. Well, then you can understand why he wouldn't call them. But he's not. What's the alternative? What is the way we vaccinate the country? It's not a race. It was a really, he made the comment the other day that was a poor choice of words. Well, yeah, it really was. But it was an accurate choice of words for him because that reflects his approach. At the time, it was politically convenient to say to people, it's not a race, we're doing fine. Now, with half the country in lockdown, damn well it's a race because we're all feeling it. And this goes to show the point, I said earlier, why weren't they using the good times when we weren't in lockdown, developing a plan as to how they would respond in the event that there was a lockdown. Well, it's the same thing now. Why weren't we using the good times to go and plan for a faster vaccine rollout?
You picked up some points there before about the research that McKell has done on COVID. I'm interested just to sort of get some more thoughts on that in terms of the economic recovery and what you guys are sort of finding from your research in terms of coming out of this and what the future looks like for Australian workers.
Well, I'll talk about the one that we've just come out in the last couple of days because it's the most relevant to where we are right now in the vaccine rollout, and goes back to forward planning. So we know from the original roadmap that as of the 7th of June, 2,000 pharmacies should have been delivering 200,000 vaccine doses per week. That's more than 1 million that they would have delivered by now. You could have done all of Southwest Sydney. You could have done every removalist in Australia for that number of vaccines. And we instead, as of today, we're talking about just over 100 pharmacists have been involved in the vaccine rollout. Now, I'm really thankful that we've announced more to come, but this is the problem with the delay. And then looking ahead, so we've criticised him for showing a lack of vision. On Monday, pharmacists will be allowed to vaccinate, and they'll be allowed to vaccinate AstraZeneca only. Now, we know that young people are more likely to be vaccinated at a pharmacy because of the flu vaccines that happen every year. We also know that people who come from ethnic and linguistically diverse backgrounds are more likely to be vaccinated in a pharmacy. 60% of people who received a vaccine at a pharmacy in the United States were African American or Latino. That's a huge demographic shift. So we know how important they are, but we also know that that young people have been recommended to get Pfizer. So where's the plan to say, well, okay, we might not have the supply for Pfizer and Moderna right now, but we damn well better get them to pharmacies as quickly as we can when they do come on board. So where's the process to get pharmacies on board? Where's the process to apply? There's no applications. There's no pathway forward. So rather than responding to events and failures, we need to look at a pathway forward. And if people at home are wondering what the difference is, like whether it matters, the difference is more than $12 billion in economic costs. The difference is 2 months of delay in vaccinating 80% of the population. So if we involve pharmacies, we can vaccinate 2 months quicker and save $12 billion of costs. And that's 2 months where we don't have to deal with state lockdowns. And if anyone can start to feel that urgency, I mean, that's the point here. We need to start being a bit urgent about this program.
It is the lack of urgency that just surprises me. I feel like, and I relate to this because I think that if I was Prime Minister, I would be like Scott Morrison. I'd basically be in the lodge the whole time watching ESPN, and then my advisors would come in every now and then and say, Mr. Prime Minister, we're copying some shit over the vaccine rollout. We need you to come and do a press conference. It'll be like, when the game ends, I'll be there in a minute, all right? That's what he's doing. But the thing is, I follow a whole bunch of sports. He just follows one. So what the hell is he watching after when the Sharks have stopped playing? Like, there's only what is he doing with his time? It's insane. I don't understand what this bloke is doing on this income that he's earning. He's just like swanning around, getting photos, making friggin' chook sheds and cooking up a storm for the kids. Like,
and you're not the Prime Minister.
Exactly.
This is the difference, right? Like, get it done.
And this is the thing I said to someone the other day. I said, you know what? There's something reassuring about our democracy in this country, that someone who is mediocre can be elected to the highest role in the land. You know, even average people can strive to be Prime Minister. There's no elitism about our not our head of state, but the number one political job in the country.
I love that you can take a positive out of it, because right now I'm a little bit more, I'm in my 5th week sitting in this house, and I'm not so positive.
It ebbs and flows. Look, the last question I want to ask more is the electoral math here, because I think that Morrison, to your point before, every decision that he makes is based on re-election and not on the good of the country. He clearly doesn't give a rat's ass about Victoria, and because he doesn't think there's no seats for him to pick up in Victoria. And in fact, he may may lose Chisholm. I think he will lose Chisholm now. But the next 2 or 3, Deakin, Casey, Latrobe, probably are safe. But, we'll see. So I don't think there's any gains for even Victoria. So who gives a shit about Victoria? New South Wales, actually, before I come back to New South Wales, Queensland. There are a lot of seats that he needs to hold in Queensland, but the majority of them are out of the Brisbane metro area. And I'm just wondering, are folks in central, north and far north Queensland feeling the impacts of COVID, either economic, health or societal, as much as we are here in Victoria? And I think the answer is, and I'm keen to get your thoughts, I think the answer is no. I don't think that they are. So therefore, I think Queensland is relatively safe for him. But New South Wales, Western Sydney, there are a lot of seats there that Labor can pick up, and I think that it is now starting to have an impact, and I think he is worried about that. And the margin that he has to hold government is quite slim. What are your thoughts on how he responds to the electoral challenge that it presents to him whenever he goes to the polls?
The Queensland keyword in what you've just said is relatively. I think you're right that they haven't felt, certainly outside of Brisbane, haven't felt it to the same degree. But also look how quickly the government responded when tourism became a big question in Queensland. Within about 3 days of it making headlines, there was a tourism package. When that package was criticised for not including flights to certain areas, remember it was a subsidised flights program, yep. Very quickly those areas were included, especially in Queensland. So I think that they've shown that they are, sensitive to exactly what you've said. I think they're fortunate. Everyone's feeling it a bit. I don't want to write anyone off, but I do think you're right that it's not as much, and certainly some have been kept afloat by some of the packages. But also, you're right in New South Wales. So in New South Wales, before this most recent lockdown, probably we weren't feeling it either so much. There'd be occasional frustrations about travel and other states, locking us out and things like that. But really, it wasn't too bad. The New South Wales electoral map has been remarkably steady for probably more than a decade now. There hasn't been a lot of movement. And so I think it's been very hard, but that's also been a form of a base. We have Morrison would be hoping to be steady in New South Wales. Possibly before this outbreak, he might have been even looking to try and, certainly they would talk about trying to, increase margins or possibly seats. But Western Sydney is where it's happening. Western Sydney has reduced access to services, reduced access to work, and are more likely to work in casual employment or in employment with different work locations. So for some people who are in maybe more professional services professions where they can work from home in an office, it's perhaps not so bad. Perhaps they've got an employer that is quite large and therefore fine, or that they themselves are fine. But more than 25% of the people in Fairfield work in casual employment. That's the place that's been most affected by this outbreak. And why were they shut down and stopped from going to employment outside of their LGA? It was because the government knows that they rely on employment outside their LGA. They know that they can't work from home. And therefore, the only way to stop them going to work was to ban them. The fact that didn't come along with economic support was, I think, a huge missed opportunity, not just for the government, but also for these people who are suffering because of it. Fairfield itself is not a marginal seat and won't be affected. But there are lots of places in Western Sydney that will be, and there might be a little movement there would very much worry the government. I think they're going to rely heavily on Gladys's popularity, and they're going to rely heavily on stability in New South Wales. And I don't think you're going to see an election called for the federal election until after New South Wales has returned to a degree of normality.
And I mean, that's the question we don't know the answer to, is when is that?
Well, the latest from this morning is that we could be here for a couple months. I think we'd be lucky to be out by Christmas, to be completely out by Christmas. I suspect that the lockdown itself will, given the strength of the lockdowns, I think the lockdowns will start to ease in about a month. And then the question will be about the vaccine rollout. And you've noticed that the government's lines have changed a little bit about, we talked about success going from 80% to 60% of the vaccinated population. But also, there's been a little caveat that I've noticed coming out of the National Task Force, and that is that of people, anyone by the end of the year, anyone who wants a vaccine will have got one, which essentially says at some point the government will say, well, we've done what we can do. Now it's your fault. Now, if you're not vaccinated. And at that point, there'll be huge pressure to reopen. And I think the government will try and get that done certainly by Christmas, and we'll have either a late 2021 election or a March, April 2022.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I guess we'll just have to wait and see. Michael, fantastic having you on the show today. Before we wrap up, any events? I know McKell not only writes very important policy papers, such as some of the ones you've just talked about today, but also does a lot of events that people can engage with. You got things coming up on the calendar that you want to give a bit of a plug before we wrap up?
We have a lot of events coming up. The one that I'm most excited about that I'd urge everyone to take a look at is we will be hearing from New South Wales Australian Shadow Minister for Innovation, Ed Husic, as well as US Congressman Joe Courtney about digital tech in the and global tech changes. That's going to be next Wednesday. And so please take a look at our Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram for details of that event. But I'd urge everyone to join in. It's digital, so anyone can access it. That's
fantastic. Love Joe Courtney. Joe was gracious enough to be a part of the Dunn Street United States Engagement Project, a program back in 2019 when we were allowed to go on aeroplanes overseas. And the delegations met with Joe in his Washington office, and was very gracious to give us an hour of his time. A good man and a Red Sox and New England Patriots patriot, I would say. Michael, thank you so much for coming on the show today. We really do appreciate your thoughts and insights. We wish you the best of luck, both with your role at McKell. You do a great ton of heavy lifting for progressives as a think tank. I really do recommend folks go onto the McKell website. Yeah, I know you can donate to McKell, so please do that. Check out the event next week with Ed Husic and Congressman Courtney. And personally, just keep plugging away, mate. Make sure you get out there for your walks and do that sourdough thing that people seem to be doing. I'm not across it. I think sourdough is a practical joke that's been played on the human race because you can't frigging cut it or eat the damn thing. But I'm told that it's very, very popular.
Well, I will make sure I get into my baking a lot more, and I really appreciate the opportunity to come and chat with you, and just stay safe, and I hope everyone at home is doing okay. It's not the easiest time, so all the best, and thank you.
Hey there. Thanks for listening to Socially Democratic. Did you like the podcast? Hit the follow or subscribe button and be sure to leave a review on Apple Podcasts or Podchaser. And to get all the latest updates on Socially Democratic, follow Dunn Street on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and LinkedIn. And we'll see you next Friday.